Hi and welcome to the Bramley Apple YouTube channel. The 135mm f2 DC Nikkor is one of the most unusual lenses I've came across, and surely the hardest to master. I remember about this lens from the 90s when I started with my photography, but never thought much about it. When one of my colleagues asked me some information about what first lens she should buy to match her new camera, I investigated about the best value 35mm fixed focal lens. But I also came across some enthusiastic review about the 135 DC Nikkor, and I was hooked. The defocus control was the personal recipe from Nikon to build a perfect portrait lens, with a specific control dial to put in more blur in the autofocus area. And it was patented, so nobody else could steal the idea. It was applied to a couple of focal lengths, the most suitable for portraits, 105mm and 135mm. And the two lenses stayed in the Nikon lineup until today, albeit selling very few units. Remember that the most important characteristic for a portrait lens is to isolate the subject by blurring the background. Not only the subject has to stand out, but the lens should make such a mess of the blurred background or foreground to erase any distracting element. Possibly the autofocus rendition itself, called Bokeh, should also be pleasing to the eye and very smooth. The best starting point is a telephoto lens between 85 and 135, with a wide maximum aperture and low glass element count. This particular lens has got all the right ingredients: 135mm, very fast f2 maximum aperture, and only 7 glass elements. The secret ingredient that Nikon added to this recipe is the dial ring that is specific to these two Nikon defocus control lenses and is patented. With it, I can add and enhance the blur either in front or in the back of the subject by moving a glass element inside the lens and introducing some optical aberration on purpose. But you have to be careful not to exceed the actual aperture value that you are using, or you will take it too far and you will ruin the picture. So, if you have selected the 5.6 aperture on your aperture ring, you can't exceed the 5.6 setting on the defocus control ring. You can dial in more blur in the foreground, like this, or in the background, rare, like this. But you can't exceed the 5.6 mark you're using on the aperture dial. You can also choose to use f4 or f2.8 or f2 if you want a less evident effect. So if you put f4, you will not have to exceed the f4 mark on this dial on both sides. Clearly, at full aperture, you will not use the defocus control, but the lens is already capable of the best conceivable result in blurring any distraction. As soon as you close down the aperture, you can choose to introduce this bokeh control system and fine-tune it to reach the result you desire. This lens has always been mistaken for a soft focus lens, and most photographers kept well away from it. But actually, it is a very competent lens, capable of great quality images and perfectly sharp even at f2. But it is not straightforward to understand how it works and how to get the most out of it. I'm still struggling, and I never had an easy life working with it. In fact, most of the time I'm not even using the defocus control ring. I just leave it right in the neutral setting and use f2.8, but I must admit that the results are unique and it deserves much more attention. If you really want to specialize on portraits and you make money out of it, you should consider spending this amount of money on the most specialized lens available. In every other case, don't bother. It also has a built-in hood, which is very useful. This lens is very useful on an autofocus camera set on AF and also on manual focus camera because the mechanical focus is smooth and precise. To engage the manual focus, you have to use this dial. So this way you see the manual focus is very smooth and very precise. And if you want to use it in automatic mode, so autofocus, you just have to block it and the lens will just block and will work only in autofocus mode. So I can use it on my Nikon D810 for studio work with strobes, medium aperture and the focus control active. Or I can use it for my nude shooting on a mirrorless camera like my Lumix S1 with available light, a precision manual focusing and at wider aperture with no defocus control. So it is a very versatile lens. Remember, you need plenty of space if you want to fit the full length figure of a model using a 135mm, so try to investigate the location before you decide to take such a heavy lens with you. And don't take the focusing lightly, because such a focal length at full aperture is giving a very shallow depth of field. I usually take pictures of pretty young girls, not only portraits but half figure and full figure pictures, so this lens was not essential for me. But if you want to take pictures of older people with more wrinkles and you want a pleasant smoothing effect that this lens can provide, then you might want to invest in this specific tool. I have made also some pictures of objects in our Milan studio and got some interesting results with this lens, so don't rule it out for product photography. It can be very sharp but also gentle with the face of your model. It also gives a special halo in the highlights and pastel colors. It makes me think of pictorialism movement, but in a science fiction future. Like if the third movie of Blade Runner was directed by a David Hamilton clone. So you can forget about sharpness, it is more than enough. The real highlights of the lens are the bokeh and the color rendition. The bokeh, or the look of the autofocus area, is really special. Also thanks to the 9 curved aperture blades that keep a perfectly circular shape even when you stop down the aperture. I will show it to you. So this is the widest aperture. When I start closing down, you can see that the hole inside keeps perfectly rounded. The color rendition, on the other hand, is a mystery, but it is welcome. You always get a pastel color with low saturation out of this lens, and it's a very pleasant effect. I suspect that it is the real reason for that David Hamilton look. I really don't want to have Bramley Apple identified with this soft and delicate style, but I still admire this lens and I want to understand it and master it. This lens is an acquired taste, like Marmite, and even before trying to play with the magic defocus control ring. The effect of this defocus control system is so undetectable that I don't bother to use it for the moment, particularly with the widest aperture. So I usually leave the dial in the neutral position. I will keep making my experiment with the 135 DC, but only for a limited number of pictures in any given shooting, and only when I can take my time because I'm confident in the abilities of the model, or when I feel she would look good with this kind of effect. And being such a long focal length, I also need plenty of space to play with. It is not easy to use such long lens in a small Milan apartment. It's like for the old Japanese samurais that used to have two swords. The shorter wakizashi was more suited for indoor fights, whilst the longer katana was more suited for open-air battles. A 135mm lens is definitely too long and difficult to use indoor, just like a katana. But I will still try to use this or even longer focal length in tight spaces, because the effect you get is really special. In the description you can find the usual links to the picture I made with this lens, and the link for a blog post on this Hamilton effect. I also leave you the link for the Ken Rockwell article on this king of portrait lens. In a future video I will speak again about this lens, to compare it with the Contax Zeiss 135 f2.8. But for the moment I thank you for the attention and see you soon.